Well, good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming to this session. And we're a small group, but a mighty group, and hopefully we'll be able to have a real good conversation. And so I really encourage and invite your participation, because you don't really want to have to listen to me just talk for the next 2 hours. My name is Abby Levine, and I'm the legal director of advocacy programs at Alliance for Justice. And we're a nonprofit based here in Washington, D.C., with the satellite office in Oakland, California. And we work with nonprofits across the country to promote advocacy. And we think it's so important for organizations like yours and other organizations around the country to be speaking up and speaking out on behalf of your constituents, on behalf of your interests. And there's so many issues that are so important. And as you know, and as you see from the work that you do and from reading the news, that if you're not at the table and if you're not representing your interests, your constituents, and ensuring that their voices are heard, that no one else will. And we know that that big business and oil companies and lumber companies and all sorts of other interests certainly have lobbyists and are up on the Hill and up at state legislatures and know how to play the game. And it's really important that our organizations are involved as well. And so what we do at Alliance for Justice is to help organizations do that. And we don't necessarily get involved in the substance of the work that you do. So we work with a lot of environmental groups, but we also work with LGBT groups and choice groups and groups working on children's issues and all sorts of issues. But what we do is talk about the framework that governs all of our activities and the ability of all of our organizations to be able to speak out, to be able to speak up, to be able to lobby, to be able to advocate. And so we walk through and sort of provide training and technical assistance on the rules regarding lobbying, on election activity, on how funders can support the advocacy work that you do and what they need to be aware of, and how different types of tax-exempt organizations can work together. And so we want to ensure that unfortunately too many people think nonprofit organizations can't lobby. We want to make sure organizations know that they can, but we want to make sure that organizations are doing it legally. And we know that sometimes some of the work that we do and some of the work that you do is controversial. There are people who may not agree with all of what you're doing, and we don't want those legal rules and some of those legal issues to stand in the way of your doing your work. And so we want to make sure that you understand what the rules are, that you're able to comply with the rules so you can do as much as you can. And so before I keep going and before we really get into the substance, and what we're really going to be talking about is how to empower you and how much lobbying you can do. And very often we focus on, or as I said, so many people think, well, we can't lobby, or we can lobby, but we're so limited in how much we can do. The limits are, while there are limits, they're really quite generous, and very few organizations ever come close to what those limits are. And so we really want to, and so we're going to talk about what that is. But before that, I'd love to get a sense of who you are and what organization you're with and what kinds of issues you're working on. And then if there are any particular questions or issues that you want to make sure we discuss today, that again, it's a small group, and so I really want to make sure we're talking about the issues and the needs that you have. So, you want to start?
Hi, my name is Karen Perot, and I'm with two groups actually. Citizens for a Fort Monroe National Park. Fort Monroe is located at the southern end of Chesapeake Bay in Hampton, Virginia. And it's kind of up for grabs. We want to make sure that the state doesn't mess it up. The Army has decided to leave, and we want to see the property designated as a national park. And the state has pretty much gone along with that. Our concerns are about development along the way from here, where southern miles of bayfront frontage there. We hate to see what development would do to add to the problems of the day. We have two different organizations. We've got the Citizens for Fort Monroe National Park, which is a 501c4,
Okay.
and a 501c3 under the Fort Monroe National Park Foundation. So we try to do everything.
Great.
But still, I think we're a little unclear on how far we can go
Yep.
under each of those types of organizations. So we get some information.
Great. We'll talk about both of those.
Great.
And for those of you who aren't sure about the difference between C3 and C4, we'll talk about that too.
My name is Shannon May. I'm with the West Virginia Rivers Coalition, which is a statewide freshwater advocacy organization. They're 501c3. So while I think I know where those limits lie, I'm not actually sure. We do an enormous amount of advocacy. It's a small state, so we end up running into politicians and position holders a lot. So it'd be nice to be really clear.
I'm Jen Myhills. I'm the Mid-Atlantic Regional Representative with National Wildlife Federation. So work through the 501c3 arm of NWF, and then I work with each of our state affiliate organizations throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, the majority of which are 501c3, but a few have C4 arms or are exploring that opportunity.
I'm Adrienne Kula. I am a policy specialist at the Diversification in Virginia. I'm new to the nonprofit world, and part of my position is to go to the general assembly on local organizations. So learn more about this.
Nancy Dolan. I'm with the Gastro and Awareness Coalition. We are a citizens group that emerged up in northeastern Pennsylvania as a result of gas drilling and the polluting of the water up in the northeast. We just became a 501c3. As a matter of fact, we're not even official yet. So I just got a clarification on what nonprofit versus, taxes. Well, there's two different statuses, and you have to be very clear on those. And so we're just learning the ropes, so to speak. And we do advocate with our local representatives quite a bit. And we've actually talked about, maybe forming a PAC in addition to our 501c3. What do we need to do? What are our limits? Can we sponsor our local representatives? Those types of things. Because we actually have one representative in our district that has been a huge supporter of our efforts. And she's come out publicly in the newspaper and everything else, but we don't know, do we have to be careful? We don't want to get that taken away from us, that tax exempt status, or we want it given to us first.
Yeah.
So that's kind of our story.
Okay. Great. We'll get to those questions.
My name is Joseph. I'm with Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I'm the outreach and advocacy manager for the Levine office. So I have the general assembly responsibility, but also in favor and I'm in opposition to. And most recently, we saw all the law forces that we disappointed in the past. So I'm lucky that we have an attorney to reviews our time sheets and keeps us straight as far as what is directly for problems. So I'm good with that. But I've got a lot of people who push back if there are a state organization, for example, the domestic partners, because they're funded through Virginia through the state program. And so they'll say, well, we can't do them live, and they're always, because it was individually you can't do it. But it's really curious how organizations that are funded through some state program, what they are and are not allowed to do.
My name is Brenna Goggin. I am the environmental advocate for the Delaware Nature Society. My concerns and the reason I'm here are pretty much been shared by everybody, but I also want to learn how to empower others. I'm pretty good at empowering myself. But so often, because the Delaware Nature Society is split, it's kind of an oddball in that it does a lot of education programs, school programs, summer camps, members programs, and so we have a very split audience in membership. And it's really hard to get those that are just focused on taking their kids to summer camp to care about our advocacy-related issues. And so I'd really like to learn how to kind of tie all those things together in an effective way.
My name is Joy Berkey. I'm the Penn Future, and for a long time, but my position is federal policy manager, federal lobbyist, and so we have to keep track of two different sets of organizations, or different sets of regulations in the different state and federal. So I'm less interested in federal. I have a bunch of little questions, but I'll hold them all. But can I add one to the list? Somebody asked about the difference between C3 and C4, and I also heard you speak about C6.
Okay.
I don't know what that is.
Okay, we'll talk about that. Well, great. And again, we're going to talk about, I think, sort of everything that you've raised as you've gone around. But again, feel free to jump in at any time with questions, with thoughts, examples. That I really want to make this interactive, and I've tried to weave in as many examples of work that you and your partner organizations are doing. But again, feel free to keep talking. So let's make this a conversation. At Alliance for Justice, as I mentioned, that we provide information about the legal rules and to be able to answer a lot of the questions that you had. And as Joy just brought up, and I think somebody else did as well, there are often state rules as well. And for organizations that lobby or that try to influence policy at the state level, most states have their own sets of state lobbying rules. What we're going to be talking about this afternoon are the federal rules. Those are the rules that govern your tax-exempt status as a 501c3 organization. Most of what we're going to be talking about are going to be for 501c3 organizations, and you'll see why in a minute. And so the definitions we're going to be talking about of what counts as lobbying, what doesn't count as lobbying, are those definitions that come from federal tax law in terms of what can you do as a 501c3, what can funders fund you to do as a 501c3. Unfortunately, the states, when they define lobbying, they often have different definitions, and both different from the federal government and many states different from each other. So for organizations in a region like this, where you might be working in Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and you may have 3 different sets of rules that you have to comply with in addition to the federal rules. The federal lobbying rules are the rules, and sort of the one set of rules that limit of how much lobbying you can do. And we'll talk about it. And again, those rules are pretty darn generous in terms of empowering you and allowing you to do a lot of lobbying. The state rules don't limit how much you can do, but rather require you to report to the state. And so it's a reporting regime, a disclosure. They want to know who you're talking to, what you're talking to them about. But again, what we're going to be focusing on this afternoon are the federal rules, because they govern all organizations regardless of what state you're working in, whether you're working at federal, state, local policy. We do have on our website something called the State Law Resources that is an online database that has the lobbying rules for right now about 26 states, and most of the state, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey are definitely on there. I'm not sure we have West Virginia yet. But so if you're working on state level issues, know that that's a resource. And if you're working in a state and we don't have the state law resources, feel free to call me and I can try to find someone who can answer some of those state law questions and direct you to the appropriate resource. But again, what we're going to be talking about are those federal rules, which for organizations like Nancy's, who is in the process of becoming a 501c3, what do you need to know for the IRS to recognize that tax-exempt status, and then what do you have to do to maintain it? And so we'll talk about what advocacy is, and really most of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is the difference between advocacy and lobbying. And there is a big difference. And so again, when we talk about that there are limits on how much lobbying you can do, those limits pertain to those activities that are considered to be lobbying, which, as we'll talk about, is a fairly small subset of activities. There's a lot of work that you do in terms of environmental advocacy, of trying to change policy, that you may be working directly with lawmakers, directly, whether maybe even with legislators, but it doesn't fall within the definition of lobbying. So understanding what counts as lobbying and what doesn't is really important, because so much of the work that we do may be advocacy but not lobbying. And it's something that in this area where we have to be very clear and very precise in our language in terms of when you're talking to colleagues, particularly when you're talking to funders and saying, oh, well, we want to do, we want to change this policy, so we're going to be doing all this lobbying. And the funder may say, I don't want to hear it, we can't fund that, and we'll talk about some of the additional rules that funders have. And so, but in many cases, oftentimes the funders will call us and say, well, we just got this proposal, and we'll look at it, and most of it's not lobbying anyway. And so, as we'll go through the definitions, it's important to recognize and to be very narrow and focused, particularly when you're using that term lobbying, that you're not sort of making life more difficult for yourself by calling things lobbying that aren't. On the flip side, you can't just say, we're just going to call it advocacy, or we'll just call it education, and then we don't have to worry about it. If it's lobbying, but don't be so overly broad that you're going to raise red flags that don't need to be there. So the first area that we're going to talk about really gets to that fundamental definitional issue of what are the difference between 501c3 organizations, 501c4 organizations, what are those 501c6 organizations, somebody talked about PACs, what is the difference between these organizations, and most importantly, how can they play together? So the most common, and again, what everybody in this room is or soon will be, is a 501c3 organization. And these are organizations that are considered to be, they're deemed tax exempt from federal income tax under section 501c3 of the tax code. And you'll see in tax law, Congress was not very creative in how we name things. And so 501c3 organizations are simply those nonprofit organizations tax exempt under section 501c3 of the tax code. 501c4 organizations, nonprofits tax exempt under section 501c4 of the tax code. Same thing with 501c6s. 501c3 organizations are those nonprofits that people usually think of when we think about nonprofits. Charitable, educational, religious, scientific organizations. So again, all of you in this room are 501c3 organizations. And one thing to mention is that just because an organization is a nonprofit doesn't mean they're a 501c3 organization. And these terms are often used very synonymously, but they're different. When you first create an organization and you incorporate at the state level and you form a corporation, which is what most organizations do, at the state level you have to decide whether you're going to be nonprofit or not-for-profit, or you're going to be for-profit and you're going to have shareholders. So at the state level, we've all decided to form as not-for-profit organizations or not-for-profit corporations. You then have to apply at the federal level for tax-exempt status. So again, many nonprofits are tax-exempt. All 501c3 organizations are nonprofit, but you could have a nonprofit organization that's not a 501c3 organization or a 501c4 organization. So just when we talk about nonprofits, the way I use it today, I'm really going to be talking about C3s, but just know that they're not synonymous. So 501c3 organizations are groups like Alliance for Justice, the LCV Education Fund, and again, all of us in this room. And the great thing about 501c3s is that not just are we tax exempt, because 501c4s are tax exempt, political organizations are tax exempt, 501c6s are tax exempt, meaning they don't have to pay federal income tax. But 501c3 organizations are the only type of tax exempt organization to which donations are tax deductible to the donor. So when individuals give to 501c3 organizations, they're eligible to receive a tax deduction. And if you think it's hard raising money now, just think how much harder it would be for your organization if you weren't able to receive those tax deductible contributions. And as I'm sure many of you sent out letters, and I'm sure all of you received letters right before the end of the year, get your tax deduction in before the end of the year, give to our organization. And that's a great benefit of a 501c3 organization. I should also say that within the category of 501c3s, there are actually two types of organizations. There are public charities, which is what all of us in this room are, organizations that receive funding from a wide variety of sources and that carry on programs. Then there's also another category of 501c3 organizations that are private foundations. Entities like the Ford Foundation or the Keith Campbell Foundation that are family foundations, or entities that were created by a family, by an individual, by a corporation. And because those foundations were created by by 1, 2, 3 people, and their funding tends to not come from a broad array of sources, but from that individual, from that family, from that corporation, Congress created some additional rules and regulations on private foundations. And so private foundations are more limited in some of the advocacy and some of the lobbying activities that we'll talk about. But in addition, private foundations need to pay out at least 5% of their assets each year for charitable purposes. And one of the most common ways that they do that is by making grants to the 501c3 public charities. While they can give to 501c4 organizations or to other types of organizations, they're subject to more restrictions when they do so. And so again, private foundations tend to only give to 501c3 public charities. So again, as public charities, we have this great advantage of being able to raise money. Now, I should also say that just because an organization has the term foundation in the name doesn't mean it's necessarily a private foundation. Like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, you're a public charity, correct? And so many foundations are, and there are many like women's foundations or community foundations that act as grant makers, but are still deemed to be public charities for tax purposes. So again, 501c3 organizations have this great advantage in terms of raising money. The ability to receive tax-deductible contributions and the ability to be the preferred donees or the preferred grantees of private foundations. But in tax law, everything has a flip side. So the more sort of subsidies we get, or the more tax deductions on our donations, the more limited some of our activities. And Congress is particularly concerned about subsidizing lobbying activities. And so 501c3 organizations are limited in how much lobbying we can do. Again, we're not prohibited from lobbying, we're limited in lobbying. But again, as we'll talk about, the limits are actually pretty generous. And for most organizations, those limits don't pose any kind of hindrance or any kind of barrier to the work that we want to do. And so I'll come back and talk about what those limits are. Private foundations, on the other hand, entities like the Keith Campbell Foundation for the Environment, are even more limited in lobbying. And private foundations are actually subject to a tax on any lobbying expenditures that they make. So foundations are much more cautious about lobbying, and the line about what counts as lobbying is more severe for private foundations than it is for us. Now, all 501c3 organizations, whether a public charity or a private foundation, not only are we subject to some limits on lobbying, but we're all absolutely prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates for public office. So as 501c3 organizations, we cannot endorse candidates, we cannot give money to candidates. But even more, we can't talk about candidates in a way that suggests who a good candidate is or who a bad candidate is. So we have to be very careful about the way we talk about the issues during campaigns, particularly the way we compare, if we choose, which we need to do with great caution, to compare candidates and their positions on the issues that we care about. So again, supporting or opposing candidates means more than just endorsing candidates or coming out forthright and saying, we like this candidate. It's also how you talk about the candidates and the issues and their positions. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the law does distinguish between direct and indirect lobbying, correct?
It does.
And that 501c3s can do as much indirect lobbying as they choose, but there is a limit on how much direct lobbying.
Nope, there's actually a limit on both.
On both, okay.
And we'll come back to that. So there's a limit on both. So 501c3 organizations can lobby subject to these generous limits and are absolutely prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates. 501c4 organizations are probably the next most common type of tax-exempt organization. And 501c4 organizations are social welfare organizations, groups like the League of Conservation Voters or the ACLU. 501c4 organizations are created for a broad social purpose. They're usually issue related. They're usually formed to work on a particular issue and to promote a particular issue. C4 organizations are tax exempt, but contributions to them are not tax deductible. So 501c4 organizations tend to be membership-based organizations and tend to generate revenue through membership dues or through fee-for-service or by getting people to donate who really care about an issue. And so C4s have to be a little bit more strategic and more targeted in their fundraising and of how they're going to get people to donate. But because C4s don't receive these tax-deductible contributions, they can do more in terms of the advocacy world. So 501c4 organizations can do as much lobbying as they want. And in fact, that can be the sole activity of a 501c4. So again, the reason we're not going to spend much time talking about 501c4s and lobbying because there's really not much to say. C4s can do as much lobbying as they want. End of story. That can be all that they do. In addition to that, 501c4 organizations can also support or oppose candidates. Doing so can't be their primary activity. Lobbying or other kinds of educational or charitable activities need to be the primary activity of a C4, but a C4 can support or oppose candidates. And then, and C4s, when they do support or oppose candidates, need to make sure they're following federal or state election law. And all of you, I'm sure, have seen in the past year all of the discussion about the Citizens United decision and allowing corporations to endorse candidates or allowing corporations to spend money on candidates. Those same rules that apply to the corporations apply to 501c4 corporations. So before the Citizens United decision, corporations like the Sierra Club could endorse candidates, but could only announce those endorsements to its members. Now, after the Citizens United decision, the Sierra Club can endorse candidates and can go on national TV and publicize the announcement. So C4s can actually do a lot more activity in terms of elections, in terms of supporting or opposing candidates than they could this time last year. There are many other types of tax-exempt organizations. So there are 501c5 organizations, which are labor unions. And then there are 501c6 organizations, which are trade associations, business leagues, chambers of commerce. So the American Bar Association, your local state chamber of commerce, the Dental Association, many industry groups are tax exempt under section 501c6 of the tax code. And in terms of lobbying and election activity, they follow the same rules as the 501c4s. So 501c6 organizations can do as much lobbying as they want. They can support candidates as long as it's not their primary activity. So for purposes, for most of the work that we're going to do in conversation, we'll talk about C4s, but know that you can sort of substitute C5, C6, and the same rules apply. Now, there are many organizations that have affiliated 501c3 and 501c4 organizations, as Karen was talking about that her organization does, or the League of Conservation Voters does. And again, because the C3 can be created to do educational programs, can receive those tax-deductible contributions, can receive those private foundation grants, to do research, to do charitable activities, to do educational activities, to do some lobbying. And then the C4 can do more lobbying, and then the C4 can do endorsements and other kinds of political work. Then there's some organizations like LCV that then have an affiliated political organization, often referred to as PACs. And political organizations can be sort of one of two forms. They can either be connected to a 501c4 organization or a 501c5 or 501c6 organization, like the League of Conservation Voters PAC or LCV PAC. And basically that's just a bank account of the LCV. Or you can have a PAC, a political organization like Emily's List, that's completely separate and isn't affiliated with any other 501c organization. Political organizations are also tax exempt under section 527 of the tax code. but contributions to them are not tax deductible. And what's really important is that 501c3 organizations cannot create affiliated political organizations. Because 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates, they cannot have an affiliated political organization whose purpose is to support or oppose candidates. You can have organizations like LCV that has this trio of organizations, this family of organizations, but there needs to be a C4 or a C6 or something in between the C3 and the political organization. Now I should say, also talking about terminology, the term PAC is used for a lot of different purposes. And as when we talked about 501c3 organizations, we talked about how C3s can't support or oppose candidates. However, C3 organizations can support or oppose ballot measures. For federal tax purposes, ballot measures are treated as legislation or treated as a lobbying activity. For some states, however, many states regulate ballot measure activity as political activity, as election activity. And so sometimes you have groups that call themselves PACs that are created to work on ballot measures. And so again, just another word of caution about terminology, that if someone says, oh, I'm a PAC, you want to ask more questions. That doesn't necessarily answer the question about sort of what they do, because you could have a PAC whose sole purpose is to support or oppose a ballot measure. And so again, you just want to be careful about terminology. Are there any questions? Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, so you're saying that if we have a 501c3, and let's say there's a contingent of folks that are members in that group that now are saying, hey, we'd like to, maybe some contingent of them want to support a candidate.
Yep.
Would they, on their own, create a 501c4? 501c4, would they start one of them and then as an adjunct to that have a separate bank account for?
It depends, and you would sort of want to look at sort of what the purpose is and sort of looking at which kind of entity makes most sense. Mm-hmm. And you could have, and there are some organizations that have a 501c3, and then there are people who are affiliated with that organization who say, you know, we really want to support a candidate. And they go off and they have a C3 over here, and then they sort of go off over there and independently create a political organization.
Right.
It has no affiliation with
Right.
the C3, there's no name affiliation, there's no
Right.
sharing of resources, it happens to be some of the same people who are involved.
Right.
That's okay. You can do that. Or alternatively, if you want the organization and to be the name of the organization to be able to carry through like LCV Education Fund, LCV PAC, then you could create a C4.
Right.
And then depending on whether, you know, frankly, with the Citizens United decision and C4s being able to do more, then the question of do you need the PAC, depending on what your activities
Right.
are going to do.
Right.
And so you would really want to think about sort of, is it these individuals who on their own or on their own together, I guess, want to support the candidate, or is it the organization itself? And there are many organizations now that I'm working with who have been 501c3s for many years and are now saying, hey, we want to get involved in the political game. We're seeing that we can only go so far with our lobbying. Even if we're doing as much lobbying as we need to, it depends on who's sitting in the State House to determine whether they're going to pass it. So we need to start getting involved in influencing who's sitting in those chairs and who's going to be voting. So we need a C4. And so it's sort of this spectrum, and no right answer. It's a matter of figuring out what makes sense.
Are you seeing a lot more activity on that front since, the Supreme Court passed it?
We are. A lot
Yeah.
more C4s are really looking at what their potential is
Right.
and sort of seeing, and I think in the last election there were many organizations, particularly progressive organizations, who were not as active. And I think now we're seeing groups saying, you know what, we really need to be as aggressive as possible and figure out how we can maximize our potential to be able to really weigh in the political side.
Now, if you're a corporation, can you do the same thing?
Yep.
You can.
The election law rules, the federal election law rules, the state election law rules don't pertain to a tax exempt status. Usually they apply to if you're a corporation. So they don't care whether you're a for-profit corporation or a not-for-profit corporation, if you're a C3, a C4. Most election law cares, are you a corporation or not? So, and that's something that we've been spending a lot of time trying to educate C4s on, recognizing that you are a corporation. You may not like this law. You may, think that you're going to be outspent by BP, and that's very possible, and you will.
Yes.
But you're certainly going to be outspent if you're not spending anything. And so, did you? Oh, okay. So again, sort of this panoply of different types of organizations, and it's important for people to think about what you want to accomplish and what your goals are in terms of advocacy, in terms of what structure makes the most sense, and whether to have a C3 on its own, a C3, a C4, a C3, a C4, a political organization, and a lot of it comes into what activities you want to do, and then in many cases, just as important, where you expect your funding to come from. Again, when we talk about advocacy is much broader than lobbying. So there are a lot of activities that you may do, whether it's holding rallies, whether talking about challenges to the environment, doing voter registration, that may be advocacy activities, but don't fall in that federal tax law definition of lobbying. And so what I really want to focus on, and what this slide is really meant to do, is to recognize that advocacy is much broader than lobbying, and that lobbying is a type of advocacy. It's one advocacy strategy, but there are a lot of other types of advocacy strategies, many of which don't get into the lobbying limits at all. And for C3 organizations, we can do as much non-lobbying advocacy as we want. It's only when we're looking at those activities that become lobbying that we need to worry about, and that our private foundation funders need to worry about. I think, this is I think everybody, we sort of understand the importance of advocacy, that it really plays a lot of different roles in terms of creating systemic change, really being able to protect the investments that you have. It's a great way to empower your constituents, to get people involved. And I think, as Brenna, pointed out, we often have this tension in organizations between sort of providing services, whether it's medical service or river cleanup or camp, and advocacy. And unfortunately, too many organizations think of, or as we start talking about advocacy, that it's sort of this add-on, that we have the work that we do, and then we have advocacy. And really, advocacy should be, and the way we should be thinking about it, is another way to fulfill our mission, and another way to carry out our goals. And we should not be doing advocacy just to do advocacy. And you should never do it just because, somebody told us we should do it. It's really looking at what is your goal, and if you look at your mission statement, look at your value statement, what are you trying to accomplish? And advocacy, when appropriate, is a way to do that. And by helping people, and it's not easy, but people who are using services, sometimes to think about, you want to come to camp. Well, sometimes there might be, as we're seeing in a lot of communities around the country now with budget shortfalls, efforts to take away property tax exemptions for nonprofits, something that most people don't really care about until, if you're a nonprofit that runs a camp, you have all this land, you now have to start, the organizations that start paying property tax, the cost of camp is going to go sky high. And being able to make those connections to people, that it's not just about saving the earth, or we're not just talking about, saving the penguins, or, sort of these big picture, sort of la 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 la, or things that, one person thinks we'll never be able to do on our own, but trying to draw those connections to their actual life. Or, your child walks to school. Is it important to have sidewalks? And being able to, and a lot of times those advocacy efforts will be much more local, and it won't be, may not even be, cleaning up the Chesapeake, but looking at your particular river in your community, or a park, or bringing, being able to find that connection. And sometimes starting really small to be able to find that win, a way to really be able to make it clear to people what you're talking about and to see how it relates to their life. And frankly, a lot of times when you talk to people and say, do you, it's important to be advocates, they'll say, no, that I don't have time for that, or I'm not interested in that. But then you start talking to them, and they're probably already doing it in some way, shape, or form. They're probably already talking to their legislator, or they ran into them at the grocery store. And we see this more and more at the local level, where people, I'll do a training and ask all these people, are you advocating? Are you lobbying? No. Oh, but at the grocery store last night, I ran into my city council member, and we talked all about this bill or this ordinance. And so a lot of it is, not focusing so much on the language and whether we're talking about advocacy or lobbying or what we call it, but of showing people and sort of those direct connections between how government, what impact government has on their day-to-day lives and the work that we do. And just for the interest of time, I'm going to skip the barriers. We could spend all day sort of talking about why we don't do as much advocacy as we want. But again, sort of for purposes of right now, while there are legal rules, we don't want those legal rules to be the barrier. And lobbying is really important. All advocacy is important, and lobbying, which is communicating with legislators, and we'll come back and define it more in a minute, is really important. And sometimes groups get frustrated. We've spent all this time, or we've spent all this money, all this effort on working on this piece of legislation. As Anne was talking about, but it didn't pass. And that happens. But you know what? The chances of it passing, if you're not working on it, are probably next to none. And so while we can't guarantee success, and I think one of the most frustrating parts about advocacy and about lobbying is that it's really hard to draw those causal connections and to say, if we do A, then we'll definitely get B or C or D. But it's pretty clear that if we're not pushing for environmental cleanup, if we're not pushing to protect the river, if we're not pushing for sidewalks, if we're not pushing for bike lanes, they're not going to happen. Because no one else will, and these are not the kinds of things that legislators necessarily will wake up and go, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do today. And so it's important to recognize that, again, while it may be frustrating, while it may take time, without us, without you, the chance of success is nil. And so while sometimes it seems like we're just constantly pushing uphill, it's important that we keep doing that. It's important that you keep doing that. So now, let's get into sort of the nitty-gritty of, so we've talked about that lobbying is one type of advocacy. We can lobby, subject to some of these limits. And I keep talking about how these limits are pretty generous, but that's all I've said so far. So what are these limits? So I'm going to start by talking about what these limits are, showing you how generous they are, and then I'm going to come back and define lobbying. What time is it?
It's about 20 of.
Okay. And I'm going to start with the limits because, again, I want you to see how generous they are. And sometimes when we start getting into the definitions, we can get really caught up on, is it lobbying, is it not lobbying, is it lobbying, is it not lobbying? And by seeing how generous the limits are, sometimes we can see then it doesn't matter. We just, we'll just call it lobbying. We'll just say it's lobbying just because. We don't want to focus on it. So what are these limits? So the limits, there are two ways that a 501c3 public charity can determine what their lobbying limits are. The first comes directly from the tax code, from the definition of a 501c3 organization itself. And to qualify as a 501c3 organization, no substantial part of the activities of the organization can be to influence legislation. So built right in to the DNA of a 501c3 organization is that we can lobby, but it can't be a substantial part of our activities. And the first test, this insubstantial part test, comes directly from that. So we can lobby as long as lobbying is not a substantial part of our activities. So that sounds great, right? But how do we measure that? How do we define what substantial is? Any thoughts?
Percentage of
A percentage, okay. What percentage would you say?
would be substantial.
Mm-hmm.
well, certainly over 50, but I'm sure it's higher than that. I would think maybe 20 or
Okay.
something.
We have no idea.
Oh.
They never bothered to define it. They said lobbying can't be a substantial part of our activities, but Congress and the IRS never actually bothered to define what that means. There's some really old court cases from the 50s that say, well, an organization whose 5% of their activities is on lobbying, that's not substantial. But 15%, that was substantial. But there's no general rules.
We have a former CEO who always said 20%.
That comes under this expenditure test. So hold on to that. Under this insubstantial part test, there is no definition of what substantial is. Under this insubstantial part test. Now, C3s have a choice. They can either measure their lobbying under this insubstantial part test, or they can choose to measure their lobbying under the 501h expenditure test. So public charities have a choice. The insubstantial part test is the default. When a 501c3 seeks its tax-exempt status, if it does nothing else, its lobbying is going to be determined by this insubstantial part test. That we don't know what substantial or insubstantial is, and we actually don't know what lobbying is. They've never actually bothered to define lobbying either. It's clear that, if you were to call your legislator and say, please vote yes on this bill, that's influencing legislation. But what else counts? We don't really know. So this test, this insubstantial part test, this default test, and that's what an organization does or uses if they take no other action. We don't know how much lobbying they can do, and frankly, we don't really know what counts as lobbying. And it looks at all of the activities of the organization. So it's not just how much money the organization spends, but it's what percentage of its time, what percentage of the activities, how much does it look like the organization is lobbying. It's an activities-based test. And if the IRS finds that in a particular year your organization did a substantial amount of lobbying, they'll either refuse to grant your C3 status or they'll pull your C3 status, which for most of us would be the end of our organizations. Because again, for most of us, we create 501c3s to be able to receive those tax-deductible contributions, to be able to receive those foundation grants.
I have a question. If there was a test, let's say it was some percentage between 5 and 15, most folks, well, not all, but some organizations are all volunteer.
Yep.
Some are paid.
Right.
Now, the people that are volunteer, that's their time. So they could say it's used either under the organization or under their free time. So how would you say, hey, it's my personal opinion, but I could also be acting as a representative of my organization?
And it's a great question. Under the insubstantial part test, because it's an activities test, it looks at both what the staff are doing and the volunteers. I mean, if you're a volunteer of an organization, but you're doing something completely on your own, that won't be attributed. But if you go and meet with a legislator and say, well, I'm here on behalf of the gas drilling
What if I
Awareness
said,
Association, and part of the reason you become affiliated with an organization is because you want to build power, you want to build connections, you want to be more than yourself as an individual. And in order to do that, and by using your organizational hat, even as a volunteer, under the insubstantial part test, that will count towards the organization's activities.
But if I went there and I said, I'm just Nancy Dolan and there's a drill, somebody's going to put a drill pad in my backyard or a half a mile, and I'm upset about that, and I didn't never mention that organization, then that's mine.
And if you do not use any resources from the organization,
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
But again, a lot of the reason why people join organizations and the reason that organizations are effective is because we have power in numbers. And you can go on your own, but by going as part of an organization, that often builds more credibility, builds more power. So under this insubstantial part test, we're looking at the activities of the organization. Because this test is so vague, because it looks at all of the activities, even of volunteers, because we don't know what percentage is considered to be lobbying, and frankly, most attorneys that advise organizations suggest that they keep their lobbying to 2 to 3% of their activities, just because we don't know what counts as lobbying. Because that test is so vague, in the 1970s, a number of groups got together and lobbied Congress and said, we know we can lobby, but because this law is so vague, it's creating a chill. We're afraid. We don't want to violate the law, so we're holding ourselves back. And so Congress created another section of the tax code, Section 501H. Again, not real creative with names here. And so they created this 501H expenditure test, which is an alternative for 501c3 organizations. If a 501c3 is created, it's subject to the insubstantial part test. In order to be subject to this 501H expenditure test, an organization needs to what's called make an election, which is simply submitting a very simple form to the IRS. And if you look at the Being a Player book and you go to page 53, there's a copy of the form that you use to what we call make the 501H election, 53. And you'll see that it's probably the simplest IRS form ever known to man, where you just put the name of the organization, your address, the date, and sign it. And you send it in. Keep a copy. It's not something that the IRS approves. It's not something you'll get a nice letter back saying, we've approved this. Yes, we have this on file. So make sure you keep a copy for your records. And what this does is it changes the way you track your lobbying and what you have to report as lobbying. And under this test, as the name implies, this test only looks at your expenditures. It doesn't look at all of your activities. It doesn't look at your volunteers. It looks at how much money the organization is spending, how much money is coming out of the organization's treasury. So in this case, you could have a whole bunch of volunteers going to meet with the legislator saying, we're here on behalf of the Gas Drilling Awareness Association. But if the organization did not pay their way, is not paying them a stipend, they can say all they want, we're here on behalf of the association, but it doesn't count against the association's lobbying limits because there's no money being spent by the organization.
What about the money spent for the employees?
That would count.
Oh,
So under this test, under the expenditure test, we're looking at expenditures. How much money the organization spent, whether it's spent on staff, whether it's spent on ads, whether it's spent on other kinds of hard costs. And one can talk about what some of those costs are. But it only looks at expenditures. And there's a formula for organizations to use to figure out how much money they can spend. What is their expenditure cap? This expenditure test provides an expenditure cap. So depending on the size of the organization, the amount of money that can be spent varies. The bigger the organization, the more money that can be spent on lobbying. And under this test, not only do we just look at how much money we're spending, not only do we have a clear line in the sand of how much money we can spend, we actually have some fairly clear definitions of lobbying. And I think even more important than the definitions of lobbying, we have some very clear exceptions to the definition of lobbying. So it's very clear of some activities that you don't have to count as lobbying under this 501H expenditure test. So for most organizations, it's to their benefit to use and to measure their lobbying under this expenditure test. Churches are not allowed to make the 501H expenditure test, and it was done at their request when Congress passed this law. So churches, synagogues, mosques are still limited in lobbying, but under the insubstantial part test. Some other organizations that may not want to make the 501H expenditure test are really large organizations. And so, for instance, I'd be curious whether the National Wildlife Federation measures its lobbying under the 501H expenditure test or the insubstantial part test. And the reason for that is, and as we get to the formula, there is a cap. So every organization, no matter how large it is, can never spend more than $1 million on lobbying under the expenditure test. For most of us, not really a problem. For really large organizations, $1 million may be insubstantial. And so for some really large organizations, they may not measure their lobbying under the expenditure test. They may, those wishy-washy, vague standard of the insubstantial part test may allow them to do more. Yeah, Anne, did you have a question?
This thing mentioned churches, that's one of the, that's a great example of the question I have. If I say that I'm coming to a men's breakfast, for instance, to talk about clean water,
Yeah.
quality of I'm wondering if you have any advice for how that's going to be done. Is it just a matter of, it's not going to
I mean, a lot of it's sort of that education and letting them know that they can lobby. And frankly, just getting information about what's going on isn't lobbying.
Right.
You know, it's a matter of what they do with that information. But you coming and talking about what's going on, what legislation is pending, isn't lobbying for them. You know, the church isn't spending money or isn't really even activities.
But even
I mean,
if their members chose to, as reference,
Right.
chose to write a letter in
Right.
support of this, I mean, that wouldn't be.
no, it wouldn't be necessarily done on behalf of the church. Exactly. And so, you know, they may see, you know, that it may be that allowing you to come and talk about certain legislation, you know, that maybe, I mean, it may be some grassroots lobbying, for instance, but still, it's going to be such a small percentage of their activities, chances are. And so again, it's sort of letting them know that they can, that lobbying is not something that needs to be kept out of the church, and to be very clear that it's very different than talking about candidates. You know, that there is, and churches, you know, I think are much more sensitive with a lot of the scrutiny over the last few years about political activity. But that there is a big difference between inviting candidates to come talk, about inviting candidate supporters, about talking about who you think would be the next, you know, should be the next governor, is very different than talking about legislation to protect the Chesapeake Bay. And the consequences are hugely different. And so, and very often if people think, you know, one of the things that I see is that you talk about lobbying or you talk about legislation, people are like, well, we can't be political. And conflate the two. And you can, yes, some lobbying can be political, but most isn't. You don't necessarily care whether it's Republican, Democrat, you're talking about the issues. And to be very clear that you're separating the two. I mean, I work with a lot of the nonprofits, a lot of the funders that we work with, you know, say, oh, well, we can't be political. We can't talk about legislation. And to be very clear that that you're not going to be political. You're not talking about supporting or opposing candidates. You're here to talk about issues.
Similar, and we've had organizations contact us and say, can you please contact,
Yep.
you know, county council or the general assembly? Leave us out of it
Yep.
because we don't want to
Right.
get political.
Yep.
But can you rally the troops? Well, the problem is rallying the troops requires help from these organizations that are bringing it to our attention, and they won't have
Right.
anything to do with it. And it's really hard for someone who's not, you know, kind of higher up in the organization to tell another organization,
Right.
well, you're not really being
Right,
political.
exactly.
Don't tell me what to do.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So it's hard balancing that, because we do hear that all the time, and it would be very helpful if organizations kind of realized that they could,
Yep.
but they choose
Not to. You know, in some way, I mean, one of the benefits of being part of an association or being part of a coalition is that the coalition can lobby, or the coalition can do the advocacy, and groups don't necessarily need to lend their name to it. And sometimes that's a benefit. There's sometimes when things are really controversial, or, you know, there are reasons why a group may not want its name associated with it. But there's still, you know, and so they may want, if a letter is being sent, for the coalition to send the letter as opposed to the members. But that doesn't mean they can't do things sort of behind the scenes to get people involved, or to get people to come out to a rally or something like that.
So this is such a good question to ask. So let's say that Ann Keekins is the men at the First United Methodist Church breakfast to get all riled up and to write a letter, and they're all volunteers, and they write that letter and they say, we're the Methodist Church and we want you to get it up. How do you possibly quantify the financial?
It's a good question, and well, you raise another good question. So depending on which test you use, whether you're using the insubstantial part test or the 501H expenditure test, there are two ways that you report it. And most nonprofits, most 501c3 organizations fill out a Form 990, which is their tax return, their informational return that gets submitted to the IRS each year. And that's where you report the lobbying. For under the insubstantial part test, organizations have to not only put a monetary value to their activities, but actually have to break out the activities and say, we supported legislation through a letter writing campaign. We supported legislation through rallies. We did a media campaign. And you sort of have to check the boxes of your activities. Under the expenditure test, all you have to put is, we spent X amount of dollars on direct lobbying, X amount on grassroots lobbying. So it's actually easier on the expenditure test. That begs the question that a church, for instance, actually doesn't have to file a 990. And again, chances, if the men got together, if they all individually wrote letters, said, somebody, I care about this, the church wouldn't have to worry. If they got together and said, as the men's club, we're concerned about this, the church, it's probably going to be such a small piece of it. If they decide to do a big effort, then the church would, need to sanction it more and would somehow need to sort of track it a little bit. But there are no clear guidance on how to do that. It's sort of a reasonableness standard.
So, we saw several of them shaking their heads at this issue, or nodding their heads. Do you have a fact sheet or a statement or statement possible if we could just have that and give it to an organization when they start to buzz to say not to work?
Yes. And actually, that reminds me, I have a sign-in sheet that if you want to give me your email address, I will send you some fact sheets, and then also, if you're interested, you can sign up for our listserv or our email list to get information about other trainings and other resources. But we do have some fact sheets, and I'll send you some. And then if there are other things that you think would be helpful, look at what I send you, and if there are other things that you see that, if you could do X, Y, and Z, or give us something that looks like this, that's what we need. Call me, email me, and we can, we want to create materials that are useful to you and that can get people to overcome their fears. So let me know if there are other materials that would be helpful to you. So under the expenditure test, so under the insubstantial part test, we don't know how much lobbying we can do, and it looks at the activities. Under this 501H expenditure test, there is a formula. There is a clear number, and that's when that 20% often comes from. So the first thing an organization wants to do is figure out what are your exempt purpose expenditures, which for most of us is what are our annual expenditures? How much money are we spending? And it's not how much money do we have in the bank, it's not how much money are we raising this year, it's how much money are we spending? How much money is going out the door? And from that, we apply a percentage. So for most 501c3s, that percentage is 20%. Organizations that spend $500,000 or less per year, which is the vast majority of 501c3s in this country, can spend up to 20% of their total spending